It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Susan Hulme. This week, the UK government wants big changes to the Brexit rules on trade in Northern Ireland.
Partial solutions that tinker around the edges of the existing arrangement, are not going to do the job.
Can a Conservative peer put £20 a week back into universal credit?
It is a moment for us to work across party divides in order to protect the most vulnerable of this nation at a time when the cold winds of inflation and high energy bills are swirling around them.
In Northern Ireland, a row on regional funding leads to this exchange at Stormont.
You're not answering the questions. You're making snide
The member
remarks
will resume
and
her
being
seat.
arrogant to the people of Foy.
Order!
You do not deserve it.
That is completely unacceptable behaviour.
And should the police be using these facial recognition cameras?
When you're being told that a machine is against you as well, it's a whole new type of injustice.
Well, the House of Commons is in recess this week after those party conferences, but there has been plenty going on in the House of Lords, and Susan Hulme is here to take us through it all. Susan, one thing that did come up this week, the UK government wants to change part of that Brexit deal. Talk us through it.
Yes, and there were questions about that in the House of Lords, and of course they have the main man, the Brexit Secretary, Lord Frost, in the House of Lords to question. I think it's worth just going back to, what this all means, because we talk about Northern Ireland protocols, Article 16, it all sounds very dry. But it is about some really huge issues. It's about whether people in Northern Ireland have the food and the goods that they expect on the shelves, and it's also about the peace in Northern Ireland that we've all enjoyed for more than 20 years now. It's all to do with whether there is a hard border between Northern Ireland and the South. That didn't matter when the UK was part of the European Union, but it does now, because that is now the border between the UK and the EU. And the Northern Ireland Protocol was negotiated by the government, by Lord Frost indeed, to try and make sure that there didn't need to be checks there. However, if there aren't checks there are checks in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. That's causing problems. It means that there are hold-ups for goods coming into Northern Ireland, and it has also made the Unionist community very unhappy because they feel that's carving them off from the rest of the UK. So the government has said, we're not happy, we want to renegotiate this. The EU has come up with proposals, the UK has too, and there's some hard negotiations ahead, which Lord Frost was talking about.
My Lords, the objective of the Northern Ireland Protocol was to support the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and it is now undermining it. I hope we can resolve this situation by agreement, but if we're to do so, we will need to see significant change to the current arrangements.
The noble lord has trashed the political credibility of the government and indeed its electoral legitimacy, given that the 2019 election was won on the basis of get Brexit done triumphalism about the withdrawal agreement and the protocol. But the noble Lord Frost is also trashing the UK's international reputation. In the words of legal expert Professor Mark Elliott, if the UK wishes to be part of the rules-based international order, it cannot pick and choose the international legal obligations that it honours.
The EU's proposals for amending the protocol are due to be published in just 2 hours' time. Can the noble Lord the Minister confirm that he will consider the EU's proposals in good faith, and that the government will engage constructively in finding solutions to protect livelihoods and communities in Northern Ireland?
Would the noble Lord the Minister agree with me that moving goalposts from positions which the British government agreed to with the EU, setting new red lines around the removal of the European Court of Justice, which is not a problem for manufacturing NI, legal firms and leading law firms in Belfast and academics, keeps people divided and businesses undermined in Northern Ireland? And would the noble Lord the Minister ensure that this stops now?
Issues of sovereignty and democracy, of course, lie at the heart of the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And does the noble Lord the Minister agree that we may solve some practical issues, and the EU will produce proposals on that later, but unless we do away with the issue of laws being made for part of the United Kingdom in the 21st century without any say, yea or nay, of elected representatives of Northern Ireland, then it will store up future problems of divergence and diversion of trade in the future.
We would like to find a permanent solution to this problem, a solution that everybody can get behind in Northern Ireland and beyond, a solution that represents everybody's interests. And that's why partial solutions, solutions that tinker around the edges of the existing arrangement, are not going to do the job.
Lord Frost answering questions there in the House of Lords. Now, as you'd expect, this part of the Brexit deal has also been a big issue in Northern Ireland this week. So let's go to Stormont and speak to our correspondent, Gareth Gordon. Gareth, what have they been saying about the protocol there?
Well, you're right. It's been an absolutely enormous week for the protocol. We've got now these EU proposals yesterday aimed at significantly changing the protocol. Though whether it's significantly enough for Unionists, we still have to see. We're now at the beginning of a 3-week, we think, negotiations, the implications of which are enormous, not least for this building I'm broadcasting from, Stormont, and the devolved institutions. The largest party, the DUP, is threatening to walk away from the institutions and seek an early election unless they get the changes that they want. Now, as part of their campaign against the protocol, they've also been boycotting these north-south bodies which were set up as part of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, this week, a High Court judge ruled that boycott unlawful, and there was an urgent question put down to the DUP First Minister Paul Givan, asking, as a result of that ruling, whether the DUP would now resume its involvement in those north-south bodies. Here's a little bit of what he said.
The judgment in the matter of an application by Sean Napier for judicial review was received by the Department this morning. It is currently being considered.
Supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the First Minister, having had his party placed in the dock yesterday, what action he now proposes to take to ensure that he and the Deputy First Minister, and indeed all ministers, will adhere to the ruling of the court yesterday? And will he also advise and ensure this House that the €1 billion of peace funding that has been pledged by the EU and others will not be placed in jeopardy by any further political antics?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In respect of the issues that have led us to this place, I am been very clear to members that the way to resolve this is through a political resolution. I look forward to what the European Union will publish tomorrow, that engagement with the United Kingdom Government, because it is the result of the protocol and the Members' Party and others in this place demanding its rigorous implementation that has created the tensions that now exist within these institutions. Whenever you trash East-West relationships, you undermine the basis on which the Belfast Agreement was founded. That has knock-on effects whenever it comes to North-South relations. I want to get a political resolution which then will uphold all aspects of the Belfast Agreement and the relevant strands that flow from it.
The days of the DUP playing politics with the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement must end today. Justice Schofield was clear and unequivocal yesterday that the actions of DUP ministers are unlawful. Can the First Minister explain here today what other blockages exist to stop DUP ministers attending North-South ministerial meetings?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the North-South bodies didn't meet for 3 years because Sinn Féin pulled down these institutions. So we will not take any lectures from the party opposite whenever it comes to how these institutions should be operated in a manner which is faithful.
So Paul Given not really giving an answer there, but I have to say since that exchange, a North-South health meeting has gone ahead because the DUP say health matters are so important they're not actually part of their boycott. So we're just going to watch how this develops.
Quite, yes. And Gareth, members have also been debating this week the shortage of workers that has been facing, well, really the United Kingdom.
Yes, and this being Stormont, this being Northern Ireland, there is no agreement about what is causing those labour shortages. This week, Sinn Féin put down a motion which was debated, in which they said the labour shortages were as a direct consequence of Brexit and an end to the freedom of movement for EU workers. It has to be said, as you will see, Unionist members could not disagree more.
The motion today notes with concern the impact that labour shortages are having, particularly in our agri-food sector, which rely greatly on workers from across the EU. The ending of freedom of movement and the outworking of Brexit and the British Government's post-Brexit immigration policies have created this situation. There is a need for the British Government to act urgently to address labour shortages and enable EU citizens to come here to work and live, and this motion calls for that and for the Economy Minister to make clear to the British Government the significant impact that labour shortages are having on our local economy and the need to rectify that situation.
I don't in any way gainsay the fact that there are obviously considerable shortages affecting various sectors in our economy. But where I do take issue with this motion is the deliberate and disingenuously opportunistic nature of the motion. Because when it says, recognises that these labour shortages are a direct consequence of Brexit, it spins and tells a lie, a falsehood. And I certainly am not going to accept the invitation of this motion to endorse that lie.
I have to say the debate is quite remarkable today, given where the parties who are doing most of the complaining, what they had to say previously. Because before Brexit happened, we had all of these predictions of great doom on the way. The economy would go into freefall. Unemployment would rise rapidly. Instead of that, the UK's economy is the fastest growing region in Europe. And consequently, we are facing the issue with a fast-growing economy and indeed less migration taking place as a consequence of the open door that previously did happen in the European Union, with some issues in regard to labour.
And the Minister, I must say that I was so disheartened in the way he spoke. I found it very bully boy tactics, attacking younger members, newer members, those who aren't experienced. How do you expect people to come into this chamber when you're going to treat them like that, just because you've been here since however long? You know, I just find it really, really disappointing. And the fact that a minister in the executive can talk to other MLAs like that, I'm just so disheartened. And I actually lost concentration during your contribution because the way you spoke to SENEDD, the way you spoke to Padraig, really, really disappointed. So I'm just going to leave it at that.
So agreement there at Stormont that there are labour shortages, but no agreement about what is causing them.
I suspect that is an issue that we'll continue to return to, not least on this programme. But Gareth, you've also been looking at proposals to ban anti-abortion protests outside sexual health centres in Northern Ireland. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, this is one of the most interesting debates at Stormont for some time. These proposals contained in a bill brought forward by the Green Party leader, Clare Bailey, which, if it passes in time, would mean that Northern Ireland is the first place in the UK to introduce such legislation. Now, as you can expect, it led to a pretty highly emotive debate, which began with Clare Bailey outlining some of her experiences when she worked as a volunteer for one of these clinics.
I was assaulted. I had holy water splashed on me. I was verbally abused. I had one young woman who was so distressed that she ran into 4 lanes of oncoming traffic to try and escape the protesters.
Their shouts of slogans and graphic imagery that distort reality is causing real psychological damage. It needs to stop.
Anything from a conversation to a leaflet under this bill would be deemed criminal. Notwithstanding whether such a definition would be enforceable in practice, this is an incredibly broad scope by any means.
I wish to begin by refuting the suggestion that to oppose this bill is to endorse harassment, abuse or violence. It is none of those things, and I absolutely throw back that slur.
Now, the bill easily passed its second stage, but it is one of the things that could fall victim if the DUP carry through with their threat to pull the institutions down over the protocol.
OK, Gareth, before you go, I want to ask you about something we touched on right at the top of the programme in our headlines. There were some heated exchanges where members debated levels of funding in different regions. What happened?
Well, rows within regions about which town or which areas is doing better out of the economic cake and not getting a fair crack of the whip. They're not unique to Northern Ireland, but I have to say in Northern Ireland it's usually involving Derry or Londonderry politicians complaining that they are losing out to areas in the east of Northern Ireland, particularly Belfast, and there was a spectacular example of that this week in an exchange between an SDLP member for Foyle, which covers the city of Derry, and the DUP Economy Minister, with a cameo appearance by the Assembly's Principal Deputy Speaker.
Minister, you still didn't actually answer my question. I said, how many jobs announcements did you make this year? So you didn't actually answer that. But, Minister, you announced 1,600 jobs in Belfast this year. Why does the DUP Minister and your previous colleagues constantly neglect the Foyle constituency for jobs and university provision? What is the Minister going to do about the unemployment crisis in my constituency? What are you going to do, and what is your response, and how many jobs have you announced? You're not answering the questions. You're making snide
The member
remarks
will resume
and
her
being
seat.
arrogant to the people of Foyle
Order!
who do not
Order!
deserve it.
That is completely unacceptable behaviour. The member has asked no fewer than 5 or 6 questions. When a member is asked to resume their seat, they resume their seat. The Minister can answer whichever of the questions he chooses from the vast catalogue that were provided. Minister.
Well, Mr. Principal Deputy Speaker, I do take exception to the fact that I've made any snide remark. I have quite simply set out the situation, which is that there has been an incredible amount of investment in her constituency, second only to Belfast in terms of council area. And by the way, it's not the DUP or any DUP minister that decides where jobs go. Investors do that.
So that probably the fieriest moment in what has been a pretty lively week here at Stormont.
OK, Gareth and Stormont, thank you very much. Now let's go back to Susan Hulme here in Westminster, where peers have also been looking at what are really the big issues dominating the news recently: the cost of living, supply chains and welfare. Susan, what has been going on? Because particularly on that last point, welfare, we've heard a bit more this week about universal credit.
Yeah, you'll remember that universal credit was raised by £20 a week during the pandemic to help people out in difficult times, but it's being withdrawn this month. Now, a lot of people say this is not the time to be doing that. It is very expensive, but they say that the pandemic isn't all over. The cost of living is a problem. We've got inflation, we've got that eye-watering hike in fuel bills on the horizon, and that it's going to be too tough for people to do that. Not just opposition people saying that, Conservatives as well. And we've had this week a Lady Stroud, who is a Conservative, and she was also one of the architects of universal credit when it was brought in as a new benefit to wrap up lots of other ones all in one simpler benefit. She was one of the architects of it, but she says that this £20 a week cut, even if it was a temporary raise, is the wrong thing to do at the moment. And she's trying to engineer, it's a little bit complicated, but she's trying to engineer a vote for MPs on that, because they've never been able to vote on that.
The reality is that the pandemic made visible what to many had been invisible. That our safety net is, in fact, at its lowest value ever since its creation. Having been founded at 20% of the median wage, it is now at a value of 12%. This became visible to people whose lives would normally never have been touched by the welfare state. So the government stepped in to protect new claimants and the public at large from being shocked by the level of welfare. It is a moment for us to work across party divides to upgrade our social security in order to protect the most vulnerable of this nation at a time when the cold winds of inflation and high energy bills are swirling around them. If there is a way to bring forward such an amendment, which I believe there is, it is my intention to do so.
Making the uplift payment, which is the answer to your question, would cost £6 billion, and this is equivalent to adding 1p on the basic rate of income tax, in addition to a 3p increase in fuel duty. The bill is very short and not concerned with benefits, as I said, and I don't say that to annoy people. So the government would not encourage my noble friend to try and draw a false link between the two separated matters.
So, Susan, that was Baroness Stroud outlining her plan. What do you think is going to happen with it?
Well, no votes this week. They don't vote at this stage of a bill. It will come back to the Lords later this month when they can vote on it, and she will try and do something, make a change to the bill so that when it goes back to the Commons, MPs could vote. The other thing I would say, though, is the Chancellor is coming up with his autumn budget very soon as well. In fact, I think it might come back to the Lords just the day before that. I wonder if some of this is really to try and put a little bit of pressure on the Chancellor to see if he can come up with something in that budget that would head all this off.
Always the period where the Chancellor is under maximum pressure, of course. Now, peers have also been talking this week, as you might expect, about some of those wider issues that we've already mentioned: the cost of living, rising prices, household bills, and, of course, supply chains as we gaze towards Christmas.
Yeah, it's been a thread right the way through this week, as you might imagine. And in fact, we saw the Minister, Lady Stedman Scott, there being put under a little bit of pressure. And I think peers were sort of giving her a bit of a prod. Before she became a minister, she used to head up an unemployment charity, Tomorrow's People. And there was a lot of sort of little gentle, polite goading of her about whether she felt very comfortable about the hardships that people have been suffering.
Every home in the country is facing sharply rising costs of hikes in not just energy bills, but food prices and in fuel prices. A lack of HGV drivers has led to empty supermarket shelves, queues outside petrol stations. Ministers reported a fear their government's inaction could lead to the country facing, and I quote, a nightmare Christmas. My lords, families and businesses are really struggling. As ever, the government will continue to assess the situation, and that's the best that I can give you right now. Now, on the universal credit uplift, I and others are absolutely aware of the angst and the frustration about this decision, and without, I've got to repeat myself, it was temporary, it's come to an end. And for those people who are not able to work, then there's one job to do. But then there is also, for people who can work, the labour market has never been so optimistic, and we must work with them through that.
Pressures such as these, national insurance increase, public sector pay freeze, rising food prices from energy costs, all squeeze the poorest. So in the light of these, would the noble lady agree that the government are gambling with family finances by ending the £20 uplift?
Susan, now one thing that was mentioned just at the end there was that increase to national insurance, which the government recently announced, and this is, of course, to fund health and social care. I think that came up in the Lords this week. What was said about it?
Yeah, that's right. The bill does have to go through the Lords, but they can't actually do anything to it. Now, just as a reminder, it's been done because of the scarring and the backlogs in the NHS as a result of the pandemic, and also to help pay for social care. I should say, of course, health and social care, they're devolved. So this is directed at health and social care in England, but a proportion of the money will obviously go to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. Now, sounds great, extra money for the health service and social care. Don't they need it? Of course. But there's been a lot of controversy about where the money is being raised, and that's through national insurance contributions, which is paid by workers and employers. A lot of Conservatives in the Lords were saying, well, this is a tax being levied from some very low-paid workers who are already under pressure, and it's a tax on jobs with employers. So they're not very happy about where the money is being raised from. However, because it's a tax-raising bill, the Lords can do nothing about it except talk about it. Normally, they like to take a lot longer than the Commons to talk about things and make changes, ask the government to have another think, but they can't do it with this. All they could do was harumph a bit.
This levy will enable the government to tackle the backlog in the NHS. It will provide a new permanent way to pay for the government's reforms to social care, and it will allow the government to fund our vision for the future of health and social care in this country over the longer term.
My Lords, this bill is, I'm afraid, a typical example of ill-thought-through legislation rushed through Parliament to spare the Prime Minister political embarrassment. If this was a plan ready more than 2 years ago, why the need for fast-track legislation?
Those who believe this Conservative government's words that they will no longer have to sell their home may find themselves, if they are asset-rich and pension-poor, likely to have to sell their homes anyway for a large portion of their weekly care costs. This sleight of hand is breathtaking.
It's a bit like going into a restaurant and being presented with the bill for the meal before you've even seen the menu. This bill certainly doesn't fix social care, but what it does do is massively increase the regressive nature of the taxation system, because it places the burden, as been put clear, on those who have least, not those who have most.
I support this money bill because what it does is it does address the sustainable financing of health and social care in the near term. And coming out of the pandemic with a huge backlog at the NHS and with the financial fragility of many care providers, it is absolutely essential that we find some money as quickly as we can in order to plug those gaps.
The view from the House of Lords on that increase in national insurance. Well, let's go to Cardiff now, where the Queen, no less, made a visit to open the new term of the Welsh Parliament. Our reporter Cemlyn Davies can tell us all about that. Cemlyn, tell us what happened.
Yes, Alex, a very big day here yesterday. The Queen visiting Wales for the first time in over 5 years. The first time, in fact, since she was last here to open the last SENEDD back in 2016. Now, this was purely a ceremonial event. There's no legal basis for it. It's convention. It's something that normally happens soon after the election. This year's election was held back in May, of course, and there's been a delay this time around due to COVID. The Queen was accompanied by the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall. They were greeted by school children. The Welsh National Opera's youth company also gave their first live performance for over 18 months. And amongst the guests as well, there was a family from Afghanistan that's recently been rehomed in Wales. And then after she made her way into the debating chamber, well, the Queen addressed MSs.
You have been entrusted to be the voice of the people of Wales, to represent their interests when decisions that affect their everyday lives are debated and decided within these walls. When I was here for the last opening in 2016, I noted that the Fifth Assembly would mark a significant development in the history of devolution in Wales. Since then, further measures have been taken to strengthen the foundations of your parliamentary democracy. The Wales Act 2017 established this Parliament on a new basis, and you've used this legislation to help the public better understand your work and to include more people in the democratic process. As a result, this Parliament is now recognised in law as Senedd Cymru, or the Welsh Parliament. The name reflects this institution's evolution over its 22 years into one with lawmaking powers over a wide range of areas that are central to Welsh life and the ability to vary taxes. It demonstrates your status as a national parliament working on behalf of the people of Wales.
As a Parliament, we continue to work through the pandemic in scrutinising government and passing legislation. We were one of the first parliaments in the world to meet virtually and to vote remotely. Even in the depths of lockdown, democracy continued in Wales. Our work as a SENEDD for the next term will undoubtedly focus on recovering from the COVID pandemic, but there will also be many other challenges and opportunities, from playing a leading role in tackling climate change to promoting equality and fairness for all in Wales.
The opening of this sixth SENEDD session is a time for all of us to look to the future. People from all corners of Wales, including those most distant from this building, have chosen 60 members to represent our collective ambitions and to steer a course for our country. In the years ahead, I'm sure that we will argue and disagree about what is best for Wales, but always in this SENEDD term, with the interests of those we represent at the centre of everything that we do.
Well, all MSs were invited to attend yesterday, and that in itself quite significant, given that over the past 18 months, the SENEDD has only been sitting either entirely virtually or in a hybrid format. And the Queen actually congratulated the SENEDD on its innovation for being the first legislature in the UK to sit virtually from the start of the pandemic. Now, not all members did attend yesterday, but the chamber was certainly much fuller than it has been at any point over the past 18 months. And now, of course, well, thoughts can turn to the future. And as the First Minister said during his speech, there are plenty of challenges ahead facing this cohort of MSs, not least recovering from the pandemic, but also, of course, tackling climate change. And over the course of this SENEDD term, there'll be discussions as well about the possibility of expanding the SENEDD, increasing the number of MSs in time for the next election in 2026.
The pandemic there, and one big story in Westminster this week was a report which was produced by two parliamentary committees which looked at the handling of the pandemic right back through last year. I think there's been a fair amount of reaction to that in the Welsh Parliament as well. Tell us a bit about what's been said.
Yes, as you say, a report by MPs in Westminster, primarily focusing on the UK government's response at the start of the pandemic. In fact, Wales is mentioned only 9 times in the 147-page report. But nevertheless, there's been plenty of response here this week. At a press conference on Tuesday, the Health Minister, Luned Morgan, apologised for mistakes that the Welsh Government made back at the beginning of the crisis. And then during First Minister's questions as well on Tuesday, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said that had it known then what it knows now, well, the Welsh Government would have done things differently back in March 2020. But all this, the opposition parties say, underlines the point that there needs to be a Wales-specific inquiry to look at the Welsh Government's handling of the pandemic here. And they made that point to the Health Minister here on Tuesday afternoon.
Your government's decisions, good or bad, have decided the outcome of the pandemic. And in relation to my next question, I'll raise a few points here. Wales has the highest death rate across the UK in terms of COVID-19, in terms of the population. The First Minister actually said that he saw no value in testing care homes a full 2 weeks after the UK government significantly expanded their testing regime. The then Health Minister said, I don't understand the rationale in terms of how it saves more lives for the way that the testing policy has been changed in England. The First Minister then said that face coverings were not a silver bullet, nearly 2 months after the UK government introduced mandatory face masks. And finally, the previous Health Minister was charged with reducing hospital-acquired infections going through our hospitals last winter, saying that lessons have been learned throughout. And we ended up with nearly a quarter of deaths from COVID picked up from infections in hospitals. Now, these issues here are as a result of Wales doing things differently. There will be good, there will be bad things in terms of Wales doing things differently. But of the areas I've specifically mentioned that I have raised, do you think that they would be adequately addressed in a UK-wide public inquiry?
These are questions that the Welsh public expect to be looked at in depth. And the only way to do that, as has been proven again, I think, by this report today, the way to do that in depth on these questions about the initial response and so many other questions about the response over the past 18 months is to have a Wales-specific inquiry. Now, I have met on a number of occasions now, including once in person with representatives of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice campaign. I'm pleased that the First Minister has also met them now. And their central argument is this. It's very, very simple. Decisions taken in Wales must be scrutinised in Wales.
We've been over this ground before in terms of Welsh inquiry. You know our position. Our position is that we would like a very clear and comprehensive view of what has happened in Wales, but we want that to be seen in the context of the UK government and what happened there. And the reason for that is, as this has demonstrated today with the publication of this report, is that actually there is a huge amount of crossover between what was happening in the UK and what was happening in Wales. Now, the First Minister met with people who lost loved ones last week to coronavirus. It was, I'm sure, a very sensitive and difficult meeting, and he gave them some assurances there that if the UK government does not listen to the Welsh government, then of course he will think again about the situation in relation to a Welsh inquiry.
Well, as we heard there, the Welsh Government has long rejected calls for a Wales-specific public inquiry to look into the Welsh Government's handling of the pandemic. But that said, in recent weeks, the First Minister has opened the door, at least, to the possibility of one taking place. He's written to the UK Government outlining what he describes as a series of tests that need to be met for the Welsh Government to have confidence that a UK-wide inquiry would give adequate attention to Wales. Wales cannot and must not be an afterthought or a footnote, the First Minister said this week. So the suggestion there from the First Minister is that if he decides a UK-wide inquiry wouldn't be up to scratch, then there is a possibility that he might consider holding a Wales-specific one.
OK, sounds like that's one to watch. Cemlyn, thank you very much. Now, we're not going to Holyrood this week because it is in recess. But when it comes back towards the end of this month, of course, we will be here to bring you all of the key moments. Let's finally now, though, go back to Susan Hulme, who is still here in the studio. Susan, thank you. With a little bit more about what's been happening in the House of Lords this week. And we had one of those moments where we had a bit of a passionate intervention from one Lord in particular, the Conservative peer, Lord Baker. And this was about the government's plans for technical education. What happened?
Yeah, Lord Baker, when he was Kenneth Baker, was Education Secretary himself back in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. But the intervening decades hasn't dimmed his enthusiasm for education. He's a big campaigner, particularly for issues such as skills and practical training for youngsters. And he has a bit of a grouse with the government's new bill, which is supposed to completely overhaul post-16 skills and training in England. Now, over the years, there's been a lot of talk about the lack of skills and that we don't have the right skills for the right jobs, and that some of this is actually playing into some of these issues we've had about supply chains and a lack of workers. And also looking towards countries like Germany that have always put a lot of emphasis on the importance of practical technical skills. So this is the government's plan for making technical qualifications on a par with A-levels. all very laudable, but there's a lot of concern about the way they're doing it. The idea is to sweep away a lot of the existing technical skills qualifications. And the fear is that that is being done too quickly, because these new qualifications the government has in mind, called T-levels to mirror A-levels, are rather untried. Before you get rid of all these other ones and withdraw funding from them, perhaps you need to be quite sure that what you're replacing them with is the right thing. There was also a bit of concern that they're actually very difficult. So some kids who maybe can't manage the whole T-level qualification might end up with nothing at all.
Disabled students are going to be disadvantaged in this reform landscape. Scrap the blasted landscape. It is really absolutely disgusting. And quite frankly, I'm very ashamed that a Conservative government has done this. What you're denying to lots of people, black, Asian, ethnic minority, disadvantaged and disabled students, hope and aspiration. This is a shaming thing. I'm very ashamed that a Conservative government could do it. And all I can say to your Lords, I apologise for the government.
I would like to be clear that the government is absolutely committed to levelling up. Social mobility is clearly an integral part of this, and education, skills and careers are vital to making a success of those efforts.
So that was about technical education. And as we heard in the headlines, peers have also been looking at the use of facial recognition cameras. Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, this is something that's used a lot in China. However, the Metropolitan Police and other police forces have been looking into it. These are cameras that can scan crowds looking out for potential suspects. The Met Police say that it's their duty to try and harness new technology in order to fight crime, but it has raised concerns with civil rights campaigners. And there's a Lords Committee, the Lords Justice Committee has been looking more widely into the use of technology in the criminal justice system. And they heard some real concerns about whether these cameras were really either fair, because there are a lot of false positives, they pick out people who've done nothing wrong, whether it's really right to be scanning people who've done nothing wrong in such a whole-scale way, and that it's not really underpinned by any legislation. It's not really been discussed by politicians or any laws passed to allow it.
If I can just give you one example of a case that I saw that made me feel with greater urgency than ever that a ban is needed. On one of the deployments that I observed of live facial recognition, a 14-year-old schoolboy in his school uniform, a black boy, was misidentified, and he was walking down the street with his friends and suddenly was accosted physically by 4 officers in plain clothes. So he would have been led to think he was being attacked. He was dragged over to a side street, held up against the wall, asked for a fingerprint, asked for his phone, asked for his ID, which of course he didn't have because he was so young. And then obviously, you know, they established that they were police officers and that he had been misidentified. This is a whole new thing for people to grapple with. Stop and search has its issues, discriminatory policing has its issues, but when you're being told that a machine is against you as well, and that you can be stopped in this way, then there's no law for it and there's no recourse. It's a whole new type of injustice. Used at scale, monitoring hundreds of thousands of people across the capital or elsewhere in the country, there is serious scope for injustice and discrimination. And that's why I think that an urgent legislative prohibition on the use of facial recognition, as we see in Europe, being called for in Europe, is essential.
Well, that's a rundown of what's happened in the House of Lords this week. Big thanks to Susan Hulme for that. That is it, though, for today. Politics UK will be back next week when the Commons returns, and Joe will be here on Monday with Politics Live. But from us for now, goodbye.